Hello, my name is Michael Vinsel, and today I'm going to continue reading my book, Travels with Nobody, and that's Stephen Stroh recalls America in the early 1980s. So anyway, today is September 15th, 2024, and we're going to start with Chapter 18, The Tree Planting Machine, and that's on page 280. Okay, here we go. Let me get a good situation here. I guess that'll do. Okay. The tree planting machine. By the beginning of March, we had finished pulling the trees for that year. For a week or so, we returned to sorting. That was a relief. We sorted the trees we had just pulled. Ernie Baldwin and Dave Fletcher were taken off the sorting crew to undertake fumigation of the fields before we could plant the seedlings that had been sorted in the greenhouses the previous year. The seedlings Junior had showed me when explaining about the nursery business. Ernie and Dave had the licenses required for handling the pesticides used in soil fumigation. Brad Keller, the prisoner, and Jeff Paquette became the new bosses of the two conveyor belts. For that week, we spent our lunch breaks at Jeff Paquette's house. When that week was done, the soil fumigation had been completed, and the prescribed wait time had passed. We would begin planting the new trees in the field. The fumigation chemicals were designed to break down into harmless substances within a few days of exposure to air and water, Dave had said. I had known about that from my time working at the apple orchard, but I didn't say anything about it. We would begin planting the following Monday. That Monday morning, Dave Fletcher led us out to the field where we were introduced to the tree planting machines. I had never seen one before. They were designed to be towed behind a large tractor. They each had a standard 3-point hitch and a PTO. PTO stands for Power Takeoff. It is what powers the rotary equipment on farm machinery. The planting machine itself was a steel platform more than 20 feet wide, with sets of wheels on each side. It had two staggered rows of metal tractor seats facing backwards. In front of each seat, from the point of view of the person in the seat, was a slot in the floor from which a shiny steel disc protruded, its hub being attached beneath the floor to a system that powered its rotation. The two rows of seats with their discs were offset so that the discs each cut furrows in the soil a little more than 2 feet apart, but each seat was 4 feet from its neighbor, so a plastic tub could fit neatly at each rider's side. The discs resembled circular saw blades about 3 feet in diameter, but instead of saw teeth, they had slots which held tweezer-like clips that opened and closed by means of a cam. The clips would open as the rotation of the wheel brought the clip toward the operator in his or her seat. Then the clip would gently close as it passed down toward the soil. It would open at its deepest extent in the soil, releasing the young tree. The slots with their clips were about 8 inches apart along the circumference of the disc, so the trees would be set 8 inches apart in rows 2 feet apart. While underway, the tubs of young trees would be kept beside each seat. The operator would hold a handful of trees in one hand, and with the other hand carefully place a young tree in the open clip, roots up. Hold it in place about a second until the clip closed on it. Pick another tree for the next clip, and the next after that, repeating the process every second. As the tractor moved, we would see the trees come into view from under the machine, all planted nicely in neat lines. Seufert Nurseries had 2 such machines. Dave Fletcher explained that first-timers often made mistakes, like placing the tree in the clip with the roots down and the tree pointed upward. This resulted in the tree being planted upside down. He said that sometimes we would miss a clip, and there would be a gap between trees. He said if it were just one or two trees, to let it go. But if there was some problem, like you ran out of trees in your tub, to holler, and he would stop the tractor. After his instruction, we got underway. The work was not difficult, but there really was only about 1 second between each clip as it passed before me. I had to concentrate on making sure to get a tree in each clip and keep an eye on the tub. When the tub got low, we would holler to Ernie, and he'd get us another tub from the stack at the front of the machine. Just a second here. It's pretty hot in here. Having a hot summer here. It's over anyway. Okay. We all got the hang of it within an hour. After a few hours, the repeated motion became second nature, and we became able to carry on conversation. At break times and lunch, Dave Fletcher would shout for us to stop planting. He would continue driving for a few seconds to make sure that no seedlings remained in the clips while we were on break. It would not be good for the tender roots to be in the open air, he explained. Ernie Baldwin covered the tubs with plastic tarps so the roots wouldn't dry out. Each planting machine had a canvas canopy that unfurled from a roller at the front of the machine and attached to poles at the rear corners like a shop awning. The once red and white festive bunting pattern long since faded and soil-stained. In the sunshine and the rain, the canopy provided modest shelter. In western Washington in the spring, any day could have sunshine or rain or both at the same time. The weather was different from New Hampshire. New Hampshire winters were much colder, but had more sunshine. There would be periodic snowstorms every week or 2 weeks, and there would be cold snaps where it got to be more than 20 below zero. But as I remember, the coldest days were always sunny. My New Hampshire friends would repeat with pride the Mark Twain adage that if you don't like the weather in New England, wait a few minutes. I had taken that for granted when I lived there, but compared to Washington State, New England weather was stable and predictable most of the time. Most of the time, New England weather arrived from the west or southwest, where it had already been experienced by New Yorkers or Midwesterners, and the TV weather reports were generally reliable. In Washington, the weather also arrived from the west, from the Pacific Ocean, from which reporting would naturally be scant. It often rained on days that had been forecast to be sunny, and vice versa. I thought about how many people adopt sayings about their home territory. I remember at a barbecue in New Hampshire, one of my friends, Tom Larch, raising his beer to make a toast. He solemnly looked around to all of us gathered at the grill. "Only in America," he proclaimed. Over the years, others of that same group of friends would make the same toast. Was that all they could think of to say? Even back then, I knew that it wasn't true that only Americans can have barbecues with beer. I sat in my seat on the planting machine in Tumwater, Washington, and watched the weather go from sunny and warm to cold and rainy, then to snow, and then back to sunny again, all before noon. I realized that I would do well to base my pride, my identity, on something other than a rugged New Englander's supposedly unique ability to take unpredictable weather in stride. Planting trees on the machine proved to be the most pleasant of all the jobs we did at the nursery. We worked while sitting. We didn't get nearly as dirty as when pulling trees or sorting, and we were able to talk to each other, even get good discussions going. I remember asking the group about the hostility many of them had toward Greeners, the students of Evergreen State College. Bethany Stage, a lady in her 50s, told me that back in the 1960s, her family had lost their farm by eminent domain for the construction of the college. The compensation had not been near enough to buy a new farm. "That's why I'm working at this dirt farm now," she said. I told her that I agreed that was a legitimate complaint indeed. "Some of them were fine kids, I'm sure, but some others of them don't look or act like they've had to work a day in their life. If you're ignorant of work, you got nothing to say to me," Rosemary Teal said. The few Greeners I had come to know were hippies. They said so themselves. They were not spoiled. Kevin Paulson and Pat Wrigley were not spoiled. Their parents were not rich and were not paying for them to go to college. They had saved what money they could and had applied for student loans and whatever financial aid was available. Another Greener, Phil Wagner, had become friends with Kevin, Pat, and me. He was definitely not spoiled. He'd been raised by his mother alone, who'd given birth to him when she was only 16 years old. But I didn't tell these stories. I just listened and let the conversation drift to other subjects. Jeff Paquette told us all about how Frank Zappa and Captain Beefheart had been childhood friends and how their careers had evolved into a musical rivalry. I had not known that. Then there was the day that Jeff's wife had finally had her baby, a son. He had come to work in the morning, as usual, but would take the day off. He had bought a box of big, cheap cigars and gave one to everybody at the nursery, even Junior, and even the ladies. Everybody congratulated him on becoming a father. Then he left, and we all went out to take our places on the planter. It was a sunny, cool morning. Mount Rainier loomed gloriously in the distance, in the east. Everybody lit up their cigar, even the non-smokers. I generally didn't smoke, but I would smoke this cigar this time. Dave Fletcher started the tractor, raised the planter on its hydraulic lift for the ride to where we had left off in the field. We all sat smoking as we neared the spot. "Trees ready?" Dave Fletcher shouted. He lowered the lever, and the hydraulic suspension of the machine descended gently. The discs began rotating, making a clanky mechanical sound, then a soft hiss as the blades cut into the soil. "Gentlemen, start planting," Fletcher hollered, imitating the start of the Indy 500. Cigars in our mouths, we began feeding seedlings into the clips, all silent, focused on our work. Yes, focused on our work, but now with somewhat of a distraction. Cigar smoke accumulated under the awning. For all the unpredictability of the weather, you'd think that there would at least be some breeze, but not this day. The stack of tubs created enough of a vortex that the smoke stayed with us, even at the slow speed of the tractor. As the minutes went by, the smoke became thicker, following the tractor like a ghost. I puffed on my cigar just enough to keep it from going out, trying to inhale as little of the smoke as possible. Everybody else was doing the same thing, but breathing the smoke was not the only problem. The fact that this work required the use of both hands constantly made it impossible to take the cigar out of my mouth. I shifted its position, rolling it with my lips and tongue. I wanted to take it out so I could just spit, but I had to keep up with the rotating disc, placing a tree every second, both hands occupied. I had to either swallow or drool. Swallowing would surely make me sick. I tilted my head to allow the drool to flow down my chin and drip into the slot in the floor of the planter as accurately as I could. It was as irritating as having a runny nose and not being able to blow it. And as dirty as we were, I didn't want to get drool all over my clothes. Okay. Now here's a picture of that. Here's the plant. Everybody sitting on the planter, and we're all planting our trees, and everybody's got a cigar, and nobody can take the cigar out of their mouth. Okay. For a second, I looked up and saw that everybody was having the same problem. People coughed and grunted unintelligible complaints, unable to remove their cigars. They drooled, but nobody spat out their cigar. I wanted to, but would it seem disrespectful to Jeff to do so? I didn't want to be the first. Nobody else wanted to be the first either. It became an unspoken understanding among the crew that we were not going to remove our cigars from our mouths until they'd burned down to stubs. We owed it to Jeff. Those cigars lasted all the way until 9:30 break. When Dave Fletcher called out to stop planting, we put our trees down and finally were able to take out our cigars. Nothing like a fine cigar to remind you that you're living in the lap of luxury, Rosemary Teal said. We all laughed and wiped our faces on our shirt sleeves, which only mixed the drool with soil and smeared it on our faces. Life with Pat and Kevin was fine for the most part. We got along well. They immersed themselves in their studies during the weeks. On weekends we would go for drives in Zippy. Sometimes I would go fishing by myself, casting from shore on Puget Sound. Pat and Kevin didn't fish. I often saw salmon swim by, but I never caught one. I had mostly little dry flies and nymphs that worked great for trout in New Hampshire. I didn't have any salmon flies like Matthew had made. I had a few Mickey Finn streamers. Those were the best fallback fly in New Hampshire, the closest thing to a salmon fly as I had. But the salmon here just weren't interested in them. I knew that salmon stopped eating when they entered fresh water on their spawning runs, but Puget Sound was salt water. I wondered if by the time the salmon got to Olympia, at the southernmost end of the sound, they had already gone into spawning mode. I could fish the salt water without a license. Down by the mouth of Capitol Lake, which is where the Deschutes River, the one that runs by the brewery, finally makes its way to salt water, I saw hundreds of salmon. I cast it into the crowd, only to have my flies ignored. It was just as well. My little fly rod would have been no match had I hooked onto one of those giants with it. In California, Matthew and I had both known that the probability of me landing a salmon with my lightweight fly rod was almost nil. But those rivers also had rainbow trout, which I had every chance of landing. Anyway, I never did catch a salmon in Puget Sound. My wages at the nursery were enough to pay my share of the rent and buy enough food to maintain myself, but not much more. I would buy Schmidt's beer, the cheapest available. It came in attractive 12-packs, sport packs they were called, that featured beautiful paintings of hunting and fishing scenes on the 12-pack covers and on each can. A northern pike jumping to shed a lure, a flushed pheasant rising, short-haired pointing, hunter at the ready in the background, a majestic elk silhouetted by snowy mountains. You could choose your 12-pack among the several. I would joke that I was normally partial to the pike, but opted for the pheasant or the Canada geese or cutthroat trout for a change of pace. I had never spent much effort to decorate my room, but I did cut out 12-pack covers and made cardboard frames and displayed the pictures on my wall. I had meant it to be taken as a joke, but I really did like that style of art. They reminded me of Winslow Homer paintings. We almost never went out to bars or restaurants. We couldn't afford that. But the college had movies on Saturday nights in a lounge area of one of the dormitories, and you didn't need to be a student to attend. It was free. They just had a donation box. They always had interesting movies. Pat, Kevin, and I went to see Dr. Strangelove. I had seen it before, but still loved it. We saw several Federico Fellini movies there. I had not seen those before. We saw Eraserhead, Pink Flamingos, The Bicycle Thief, Atomic Cafe, Beatles movies. They were always double features. They had coffee and popcorn. They provided nutritional yeast as a topping for the popcorn. I had never had that before. It reminded me of the so-called cheese popcorn that had fluorescent orange powder on it that was somehow supposed to make one think of cheese. There were always lots of girls at those movie nights, but I was never able to get to know any of them very well. It was there that I first heard the term politically correct. A girl, I should say a young woman, young? How young? Was her age part of my assessment of her? A woman had said that something she'd seen or heard wasn't politically correct. It wasn't anything to do with me. It was something somebody else had said. But that phrase caught my attention. The word correct. Why use the word correct instead of inclusive or accommodating? I wondered. I felt that matters of politics were usually matters of opinion, of perspective, matters of degree, and of compromise, not simply of correct or incorrect. I understood that whatever it was that the woman had seen or heard was something that would bring discomfort or offense to someone else, and that when people denigrate or insult others, even if it is unattended, the offense should be pointed out. I could agree with that. I, for one, would not want to unknowingly offend someone by saying something that maybe I'd heard often in New Hampshire, but wouldn't be okay outside the circle I grew up with. And the word politically, what did that word actually mean? I really didn't know. I knew that politics were all about how the government works. Politicians were people in government. But what did it mean as an adjective? No, it would be an adverb, but modifying the word correct. Correct can be a verb. I imagined how it might be used in a sentence. Mrs. Smith, I'm in a hurry. Could you please quickly correct my essay? Quickly. Now that's an adverb. But correct isn't a verb. Correct isn't a verb in politically correct. It is an adjective. So in this phrase, an adverb is modifying an adjective. Is that how it works in the English language? I decided to try it out in my imagination. As monetarily cheap as it is, Schmidt's beer is politically good when it is correctly cold. I kept these thoughts to myself. I was beginning to recognize how much damage I had done to my education by paying so little attention in school as I had. I had a lot of catching up to do, I knew. I enjoyed the movies and the intellectual calisthenics on those movie nights. I never did become the target of any accusations there. I spoke carefully when I spoke at all. There was a coffee shop called the Asterisk on the edge of Olympia, on the road that led to Evergreen. I went there the first time because I thought it might be like the Café Trieste was in San Francisco. I ordered a cappuccino. I had seen the waitress before, at movie nights at the dormitory. She lived in that dorm. I forget her name. She had long, dark hair in a long braid down her back, and wore a long lavender cotton dress with a batik design on it. I thought she was beautiful. I was later disappointed to learn that she had a boyfriend. She asked if I went to Evergreen. I told her I didn't, but that I hoped to go to college someday, whether it be Evergreen or somewhere else. I told her that my housemates did go. I told her their names. She didn't know them at the time, but in the weeks to come, she and they would become friends. Pat and Kevin smoked weed, and her boyfriend happened to be perhaps the main dealer at Evergreen. So Pat and Kevin wouldn't have to go all the way to Vashon Island. But that would be a few weeks later. That first time at the Asterisk, I asked the waitress what music it was that was playing. She said it was Joan Armatrading. The song was called Down to Zero. I had heard it before, but never paid attention to it. It was slow and soulful and sad. The waitress left to attend another customer. I sat at the table next to the window, looking out to the parking lot and to the road. It had started to rain, just a soft, foggy drizzle that seemed like it would last for days. I remember the feeling of that day. I felt so far from home. It had been about 4 months since I'd left New Hampshire. It was only a little more than that since the night of the harvest party at the apple orchard, the night that Tracy Bass had said she wasn't the girl for me. I knew I had to move on from that night. It occurred to me that that day at the Asterisk was the first anniversary of my mother's death. I had not thought about that. But there was a calendar, 1 year to the day. Where was I now? What was I doing here? I didn't know. That must have been a Saturday afternoon. After Kevin, Pat, and I had gotten our own place, my sister Terry and Ken had taken on 2 tenants to rent the spare rooms in their house. They were both Evergreen students. One, a guy named Mike, and a girl named Diane. Sometimes when I went over to visit, we would all eat dinner together like a family, with the kids and all. After dinner, sometimes Ken, Mike, and I would walk into town and go drinking at one or another of the bars. Mike was from Southern California. He had a manner of speaking that I found very interesting, saying things like hella good and gnarly or bitchin', all meaning good. The 3 of us had fun drinking together, but it didn't always end happily because Terry was always stuck home and taking care of the kids. She was obviously unhappy with the situation. A few times I ended up walking all the way back to our place in Lacey, which took about an hour. Pat and Kevin had gotten another kitten, this one orange with brown tiger stripes. They named it Salmon. So now there were 2 cats. Trout was still small enough that he got used to having Salmon around, and they didn't fight. But they both attracted fleas. In New Hampshire, our family had had a cat, and I had never noticed our cat ever having fleas, but these 2 had lots of them. I had not known that fleas are more common on the West Coast than in New England, but they certainly were. Kevin bought flea collars for them, and I suppose those worked to keep the fleas off the cats. But it seemed that the fleas had just jumped off the cats and took up residence in the carpet, because we started getting flea bites on our ankles. Kevin had an active mind toward problem solving, always coming up with inventions for things. He had read that fleas cannot swim, and that if they drop into water, they will not be able to get out and will drown. He had also read that they are attracted to light, so he bought a Christmas candle ornament with an electric light bulb and set it on its side atop a stack of books taped to the top book such that the bulb rested about 8 inches above the water in a large mixing bowl in the middle of the living room carpet. He would leave the light on through the night and see how many fleas he found in the water in the morning. It worked. In the morning, after the first time, there were more than 20 fleas floating dead in the water. We decided to keep it that way permanently. Every morning there would be fewer and fewer fleas, and we got bitten less and less. The food co-op in Olympia sold Nicaraguan coffee, in defiance of President Reagan's efforts to isolate the Sandinista government there. It was good coffee, and we bought it hoping to do well for the farmers who grew it. We also appreciated the forbidden fruit aspect of it. At that time, there was no trade embargo in place against Nicaragua, as there was with Cuba, but it seemed as if one might be imposed any day, given the efforts by Reagan to escalate the Contra War. Kevin had a one-quart stove top espresso maker made in Italy, one of his prized possessions. The Nicaraguan coffee was not espresso, but it was very good made that way anyway. We would also make a large bowl of whipped cream. He and Pat had few kitchen items, but they did have those necessary for making cakes and whipped cream. At night, after dinner, if they didn't have college work to do, we would sit together with great mugs of that coffee with whipped cream. We would turn off the living room lights except for the Christmas light over the bowl of water, and we would leave the kitchen light on, which gave just enough light for Pat to read by. She would read aloud excerpts from books. She and Kevin would smoke weed. I stuck with the coffee, sometimes put whiskey in it. Pat's parents had been professors. They had raised their children to be readers, and Pat and her brother and sister were all avid readers. Half of the possessions Pat and Kevin had hauled across the country in Zippy were boxes and boxes of Pat's books. I remember Pat reading, there in the dim light, erotic stories by Anais Nin. Pat had 2 of those books, Delta of Venus and Little Birds. She explained that Anais Nin had been a big influence on Jim Morrison. I had not known that. She also read Howl by Allen Ginsberg, parts of books by William S. Burroughs, Bertolt Brecht, Gertrude Stein, Lillian Hellman, and others. I had heard of most of the authors she read, but had read hardly any of them. Those were enjoyable nights. In the mornings, we would check to see how many fleas had drowned in the night. One day we all drove out to Olympic National Park on the Olympic Peninsula, to a hot spring in the woods. It must have been March. There was still snow at the hot spring in the mountains. There was no development at the hot spring except that a spring of 4 pools had been dug out, each pool about 10 feet across, 2 feet deep. Each pool separated from the next by dams of piled rocks. The first pool was dangerously hot. The next, too hot for me. The third was perfect, and the fourth was not hot enough. We had brought sandwiches, and I had a Schmitz sports pack. We hiked up from the road, 20 minutes or so, stripped, tested each pool with a foot, and settled on the third pool. Pat had brought a camera. She also was an avid photographer. She took pictures of Kevin and me sitting there in the hot spring, just like on Mount Rainier. In the hot spring. Just like on Mount Rainier, Canada jays live on the Olympic Peninsula. A flock of them descended upon us. It was Kevin and Pat's first time to see these birds. I was sitting in the water, steam rising all around, moss hanging from tree branches. I opened a beer. I held up a finger, and quickly 2 birds alit. There I was, beer in one hand, 2 birds jostling to perch on the other, sitting in an otherworldly paradise. Pat kneeled to get the picture. She took many pictures that day. A few days later, we went together to the darkroom at Evergreen. Pat had processed the film the previous day, and with us all in the red light of the dark room, she developed the pictures one by one. I remember when she got the picture of me with the birds, she focused on the image. She focused the image on the paper under the enlarger and snapped the button. There was a flash of white light, then just the eerie red safety light. She handed me the sheet of photo paper, blank, and brought me to the trays of developing chemicals. She showed me how to immerse the paper and move it around a little with the special tongs they had for that purpose. We watched as the paper went from blank white to having ghostly shadows of gray, to the gray becoming darker in places, until we could make out the image that was coming forth. I watched the image of my face become recognizable, a happy face, the forest darkening behind me, the birds fluttering precariously on my hand. It was a beautiful picture. A few years ago now, when I must have been 52 or 53, Pat sent me an email with a scan of that and several other photographs she had taken in those days. I still have the image at home. I haven't seen Pat or Kevin for more than 20 years now. That year in Olympia, when I had just turned 21, I remember there was less rain and more sunshine as the winter ended. In the sunshine, the fresh sprigs of new growth on the tips of the conifers glowed so bright, so pale, reflecting the golden light in the evening. It was just so beautiful. I remember walking with Kevin and Pat in the hills of Capitol State Forest, all of us momentarily silenced at the beauty. I wondered if I would settle there. What would I need to settle there? I would need to buy land. If I had a piece of land, I believed I would be able to grow my own food and make most of what I needed. I would have to do some part-time work to provide what money I'd need to buy the things I wouldn't be able to make. Having worked at the orchard in New Hampshire and at the nursery here, I felt that I was gaining skills, farming skills, that I would be able to use in the future. But I realized that my vision of living by growing my own food and making the most of what I needed, living outside of conventional civilization, was a product of contingency planning, a process I had begun as soon as I began to realize that there was something lacking in me that would prevent me from attaining skills and credentials necessary to find gainful employment as an adult. I worried about my real prospects of going to college. What would I study? What was I good at? No answers to these questions came to me in those days. One night we were at the house listening to Pat read, and the phone rang. It was my father. He asked me how I was doing. I told him I was fine, that I was working at the nursery. He told me that the reason he was calling was to inform me that he and Martha Sanford were going to get married. I congratulated him and assured him that I was okay with it. He said he wanted me to be at the wedding. If I needed money to get an airline ticket, he would send a check. I told him that I would need money for that. An invitation card with a check for $200 arrived a few days later. I went to a travel agent to see how much it cost to fly to Boston. I would be able to fly, and I would be able to buy a ticket. I asked if there was anything cheaper. The agent couldn't find anything on that day. I didn't buy the ticket at that time. I told the agent I would be back in a few days. The wedding wasn't for another month. At the house, I called several airlines and travel agents, and I found that it was cheaper at that time to fly from Vancouver to Montreal than it was from Seattle to Boston. Even with bus fare to Vancouver, it was still cheaper. I decided to do that. I told Kevin and Pat that I'd be leaving. I didn't know how long I'd be gone. I knew that once back in New Hampshire, I would have to work to save enough money to get back to Washington. They were fine with it. I had been afraid that they would be upset, but they weren't. The lease on the duplex was only for 6 months. It would be up that summer. They were hoping to find a better place after that anyway, somewhere closer to Evergreen. My car still ran, but was getting hopelessly slow. Ken told me he could get rid of it for me. He knew of a garage that specialized in European cars. Herr Reinhardt, that's what Ken called the man, dragging out the R in a mock German accent. He would probably take it for the parts. That was good enough for me. I left my bicycle at Ken and Terry's house, along with my skis. Okay, that's the end of chapter 18. So I'll see you next time, probably next week. Okay.